Welcome, everybody. We're glad to have you tonight on this Cinco de Mayo for another part in our interfaith learning course. We're really excited to be joined by Rabbi Nancy Kramer, PhD. And I guess I should also, right before I introduce her, just say my name's Ray Ranker. I'm the Lutheran campus pastor at the University of Maryland. And I actually got to meet and know Rabbi Nancy through a group that she put together through the Henry Luce Foundation, and through her being a professor emeritus of religious studies and director of the Department of Multi-Faith Studies and Initiatives at the Reconstructionist Rabbinical College in Philadelphia. We were so lucky that Rabbi Nancy gathered a group of interfaith chaplains from around the Northeast, and we got a chance to hear what each other are doing and how we're doing interfaith work on campuses to make some plans also for our own campuses and with the support of the organization. So some of her other projects include dialogue retreats for emerging Muslim and Jewish leaders, cultivating character, a conversation across communities, and the one that I mentioned, the campus chaplaincy for a multi-faith world. She also has pioneered innovative community-based learning opportunities for rabbinical students from across the denominations and their peers of other faiths. She's the past president of the Reconstructionist Rabbinical Association and served on its ethics committee. She's a founding board member of the Interfaith Center of Greater Philadelphia and Shoulder to Shoulder, an initiative of the Islamic Society of North America and the Sisterhood of Salam Shalom. Rabbi Nancy, we had a conversation with Catherine Laurie of the ELCA, and when I mentioned that we were gonna have you, she was just so excited, and that it just goes to show that just your activity and involvement in interfaith initiatives have just had such a great impact across this country. Nancy and her husband have a goal of doing a half marathon in all 50 states. I loved reading that. Of course, they're all like canceled now, but you can still, you got to get out and keep up the training there. But so as of March, they had accomplished 23 of them, plus the District of Columbia. They look forward to picking up their practice when it's safe to travel again. Where's the funnest place you've done a half marathon?
Oh, that is the most beautiful or the most fun?
Let's say beautiful. Yeah.
Okay, well, the most beautiful half marathon we did was in Marin County, California. It was it had ocean and mountains and everything. It was just magnificent. I just fell in love with Marin County. It was very gorgeous. And we've been to a lot of beautiful places. But in terms of fun, oh gosh, let me think. I think the most fun was when we were in Maine and we got to run across the border into Canada. And we had to bring our passports with us. And we went across the border into Newfoundland, or New Brunswick, into New Brunswick, and it was really exciting. It was really fun.
That's cool. So you got a second country in there too so far.
Yeah. But that's not part of our goal. Our goal is just 50 states.
Yeah, that's good. Well, and you just retired from teaching in February of this year. You missed the classroom, and but you do get to enjoy time with your two grandsons, 4 and 5 years old. They live just a couple miles away.
I don't get to see them anymore, but
yeah, or maybe just on FaceTime.
That was the idea. Anyway, yeah.
Well, Nancy, we're just so glad to have you, and thank you so much for taking the time to be with us.
Sure. Well, welcome everybody. This is a little weird because I do like to get feedback and I love the interaction of teaching, so it's very strange. And I'm told that you are not permitted to speak, that you have all been muted. However, you have access to a chat. And Ray is going to tell me what's coming up there, because I do want to know what I'm dealing with here, because it's important for me to know as I explain things what your backgrounds are. And you don't have to tell me your whole life story here. I'm just like basically, what tradition you are most familiar with. I guess that would be a good way to put it. What religious tradition, if any, you know something about already, either because you were born into it or you've chosen it. So yeah, Katie, what about you?
And folks can type in the group chat there.
I'm turning my phone off. Okay. So Katie grew up. So should I read them or are you going to read them aloud? I think
Go
Ray,
ahead,
you
you
should
can.
read. I
Okay.
think Ray should read them out because that way, if someone's watching it afterwards, they won't see the chats.
Yeah, right. So
If they watch,
Katie Christian, she grew up Methodist and now identifies as a Lutheran.
right.
And Jen, JT, Brenda, we'd love, JT writes Christian, Lutheran.
Okay.
And Jen, Christian, Lutheran my whole life.
Okay.
They're both some of my students there. Brenda, I don't know if you have a chance to type there. Christian Scientist, grew up Baptist.
Great. Okay. Is Brenda, are you moving? Are you just okay, I got it. Brenda has a picture on her screen,
Right.
not a moving thing, but that's interesting. She looks like she's really paying attention. Okay,
Yeah.
folks, so let's give this a shot. And, we have to be kind to each other because we don't really know, I'm learning as are you, how to do this.
And I'll just say, Katie will put in the chat here a link to a Google form. And for folks, as you come up with questions, feel free to do one of two things, and that's type it right into the chat, or you can also send it to the Google form, and that's a chance for it to be a more anonymous question if you prefer. But Rabbi Nancy has said that she's happy to entertain questions along the way, so don't feel like you have to hold on to them.
Okay, so now I just tried to do it and I don't know that it happened.
There
Yes,
you are.
it did.
All right.
Okay, so hi everybody. Now it really is weird because now I can't see any of you. I thought I would see you in a corner, but not. So I'm just seeing my screen. There's not a way I can see half the screen and then the other half I could see the people's faces.
I don't
Yeah,
know.
there's a way of doing that. I've done that, but okay, you can't do that. So I'll just have to wing it. So now you're looking at a screen of Introduction to Judaism, and I'm talking into a void and have no idea what's happening. But please, I would love it if Ray would see some chats and people would ask questions because it would make me feel less like I'm just talking into a void, okay?
Okay, before you start, we have 3 questions. No, I'm just kidding. I'm just kidding.
Okay, so now I'm trying, yes, here we go. So what is Judaism? So Judaism is not a thing. Judaism is not Judaism doesn't wake up in the morning and brush its teeth and go out into the world. Judaism is an abstraction. And there's actually no such thing as Judaism. It's an essence of, used to be in the 19th century, people wrote books called The Essence of Judaism, but there is no essence of Judaism. People will tell you otherwise maybe, but I'm telling you what I believe. I believe that Judaism is the evolving religious civilization of the Jewish people. It is constantly changing. It is diverse. There's no one idea that I can tell you that every Jew believes. There are many, many varieties of Jews. And what we talk about in Judaism, you may also talk about this in Christianity or maybe not, is believing, behaving, and belonging. Okay? And what we know to be true about Judaism is that many people have different beliefs within Judaism. There's some things that are constant, we'll talk about that, but the believing is there's quite a spectrum, quite a vast array of beliefs that have been over the centuries and today over the globe belong to Jews. Behaving is really important in Judaism, maybe more so than in Protestant Christianity, which is where most of you are from. But behaving is absolutely, if anything, more important than believing in Judaism, in that there are certain behaviors like a Passover Seder, like circumcising a baby boy on the 8th day, that are much more constant actually across all Jews than beliefs. Just saying. But then there's belonging, which is actually completely the piece that everybody is is united around. It begins with the sense of belonging to the Jewish people. And for many Jews, that is the essence of being Jewish, is that they're Jewish, that they know that they're Jewish, that their identity is Jewish, that they belong to something bigger than themselves, that is the Jewish people. And out of that grows certain behaviors that they understand to be either recommended or required. We'll talk about that because that's the different kinds of Jews that there are, and certain kind of beliefs that they sometimes share, sometimes argue with, sometimes disagree with, because believing in Judaism is, as I said, it's kind of, Jews like to argue and they like to question and they like to ask about things. So beliefs are not set. We don't have credo in the same way. Again, I'll say Protestant Christianity because I know that many of you, that's where you're coming from. But I would say that if you want to understand Judaism, start with belonging, then look at behaving, how Jews behave, the different things that we do, different practices, and then go to beliefs. And then it goes around in a circle, though, because the beliefs are also, as you live your way through behaving into believing in certain things, you then we circle back to belonging. So before I go into what we do, and I want to tell you that there are different kinds of Jews. You know this because you live in America, and you probably encountered some of this. But you may not have ever kind of seen it all laid out for you just like this. And it may actually, I hope, I've had the experience in the past when I've talked with people about things like this, you've had the experience of maybe this clarifies something you didn't really know before. So there are different movements in Judaism. And before the French Revolution, before the Enlightenment and the emancipation of Jews in Europe from the time when they had no freedom at all and they were considered, second-class, third-class citizens who couldn't vote, who couldn't participate, who couldn't have citizenship in Germany, France, England, or wherever they were living. Before that time, there really wasn't different kinds of Jews. There was one kind of Jew, and they were Jews. They were traditional Jews. That's what they were. And that changed as Jews were emancipated into Western culture and Western society. In America, we never needed to be emancipated because from the very beginning of the American experiment, Jews were considered citizens. So for Jews in our country, that's been something we've had a lot of options all along. But for most of Judaism, the options began at different times. So for example, if you saw Fiddler on the Roof in Eastern Europe, in the shtetls of Russia, they hadn't been emancipated yet in the early 20th century, in the 1900s, when Fiddler on the Roof is set, which is right around 1910, the beginning of the 20th century. People didn't say, I'm Orthodox. They just were Jews. That's what they were. They didn't have a lot of choices. If they stopped doing that, like one of the daughters in the Fiddler on the Roof ends up marrying a non-Jew, well, that's something else. Then they stopped being Jewish. But as long as they were Jewish, there was one kind of Jew, and they called it Jews, traditional Jews. But once we started to have choices, oh my goodness, Jews developed all kinds of options, right? So there's Orthodox. Those are the people who say, okay, we get it. We can do whatever we want. But guess what? We actually want to keep doing the tradition as we understand it. We understand ourselves to be obligated to do the Torah and the laws, the Talmud. We'll talk more about what that all is. And there are ultra-Orthodox Jews, and then there's something called modern Orthodox. And those people also try to follow rigorously the rules as they understand them, but they also live in the modern world. The ultra-Orthodox do their own thing. Like the ultra-Orthodox often, like if they live in Israel, they don't serve in the army because they don't participate in the society. Even in Israel, they set themselves apart. And you may have heard about some ultra-Orthodox communities and seen them in the news or whatever. Modern Orthodox, you might not even know someone was modern Orthodox. If it's a man, you might see him wearing a kippah, say, oh, oh yeah, but he's going to work in a stock exchange or at a, whatever, university. My husband's a law professor. He has a colleague who's a law professor, tax law, and he's a modern Orthodox Jew. He never shows up on the holidays to the Penn Law School. He follows the rules, but he lives a more modern life. Then there's Hasidic, which is different than just regular old Orthodox. And many people know about Hasidic because they see Hasidic is very visible. It's a movement that came out of Judaism in the 18th century, in the 1700s, based on an idea that Judaism, as then was known, ultra and modern Orthodox, was getting a little bit too strict and rigid. And the Hasidic people didn't want to not be law-abiding, but they wanted to have some joy in it. They wanted to have religious passion. So they became Hasidic. Then there's Reform, which is a whole other thing on the other end of the spectrum. This started in Germany. It started in the 1800s, 19th century, by people, Jews, who said, hey, we're allowed to be modern now. And guess what? That's what we want to do. We do not want to keep kosher anymore in the same way that these Orthodox Jews are doing it, that we were taught to do it. We don't want to do any of the stuff that we think of as just rituals. And we don't think that it was given at Sinai. We don't believe anymore that God is looking over our shoulders and requiring us to do this law. We want to be Protestants who are Jewish. Basically, they want to believe in God. They want to do good deeds. They want to be part of the world. They want to be assimilated or incorporated into the modern world. And the Reform Jews, very many of them are the ones that you first saw in the United States. Okay, this is getting a little complicated now. Then we get conservative Jews. Conservative Jews was a reaction to Reform. And those people, I'm going to make this really simple now, didn't want to be reformed. They thought they were throwing out the baby with the bathwater. They agreed that they didn't want to be Orthodox, but they kind of didn't want to just give up all those traditions. They didn't want to give up praying in Hebrew. The Reform started praying in English or German or whatever language country they lived in, mostly German and English. The conservatives were like, no, actually, we liked praying in Hebrew, and we liked wearing a tallis when we prayed, and we liked doing all of those rituals and keeping kosher and keeping Shabbat, but we don't want to be Orthodox. So that's conservative. So conservative Jews, I was talking to Ray before, when we had the shelter in place, we couldn't go to Passover Seders like we used to in our lives. And so Orthodox Jews pretty much said, well, that's too bad. You'll just have to have Seder with whoever you're living with at this moment in time. And obviously Hasidic. Reform, it was not an issue. They would travel and turn on machines anyway. But the conservative rabbinate had a ruling that said, you know what? This is a very special time. You can use your computer on the holiday. Even though for many conservative Jews who are more observant, they don't use their computers on the holidays and the Shabbat, but this time they said yes. Then there's Reconstructionists, which is what I am, and that's even more complicated, but it grows out of conservative. And Reconstructionists are people who think that the conservatives have the right idea, which is don't be Orthodox and don't be Reform, try to get the best of both worlds. But we wanted to move things along faster than the conservatives were moving them along. So we have the same concept of evolving the law for the 20th, 21st century. But whereas the Reconstructionists said, hey, we're going to ordain gays and lesbians, that was in the 80s. It took the conservatives until 20, 30 years later to come up with that. So we just move things along a lot more rapidly, and I'm going to leave it at that. Then there's something called renewal. You may have encountered, and renewal is another movement that is neo-Hasidic. So they are people who love what Hasids do. They love the joy, they love the singing, the dancing, the meditating, the chanting, the very soulful, mystical aspect of Judaism. And they don't want to be Orthodox. Most the Hasidic are still Orthodox. They want to be sort of not Orthodox, and they call themselves renewal. And then there are Jews who are secular humanists who love the Jewish tradition but want absolutely nothing to do with the religion per se, but they celebrate Passover as a wonderful secular values-based holiday. And then there are cultural Yiddishists, who are people who identify with the Yiddish culture that was pretty much destroyed during the Holocaust, but they love it to this day, and they learn Yiddish, and they sing and dance klezmer music, and now I will just say one more thing that will confuse you even more, and then I'll stop talking, which is that there are Zionists running up and down through all of this. That is not a separate group. Zion, you can be an Orthodox Zionist, you can be a Hasidic Zionist, conservative, Reconstructionist, cultural Yiddishist, whatever. And any of these people could also be Zionists. Okay? Now, is that really, did I just confuse you all terribly? And can I beg you to ask me a question?
Yeah, we have a couple questions here.
Great.
And I think this is really helpful because we do hear these terms. If you would a specific synagogue, the synagogue down the street from me, is that going to be one of these?
Yeah.
It's either going to be Reformed or it's going to be Orthodox.
Yeah, that's exactly right. Unless you live in a very small town where there are very few Jews. And even then, it's going to be one thing or another, but everyone's going to have to come and just put up with it. So if you live in a very tiny village in Idaho, and there are very few Jews, and there's an Orthodox shul there, and you move there, and you're not Orthodox, you're out of luck. So you go there. So there'll be people at the synagogue who are not Orthodox, but the synagogues are one or the other, and rabbis are one or the other. Rabbis get trained. There are little tiny exceptions, like some Reconstructionist rabbis are also renewal, but that's a fine point. Basically, it's, yes, that is correct.
And then is there much, would you say there's much movement of somebody is born into a Reformed tradition, they could?
Yeah, there's a lot of movement. There's a lot of people who grow up ultra Orthodox leave. They leave. They go what they call off the derech. The derech is the road, the path. They go off the path. And there's a show now on, I think it's Amazon or Netflix, called Unorthodox, which is about somebody doing that process of the journey of leaving the traditional lifestyle. Fortunately for them, they have multiple babies in their families. They don't practice birth control, so they have lots of children. So there's a lot of replacement of the ones who leave. So it looks like Orthodox groups don't shrink, but they actually would shrink because there's a lot of movement away, but not everybody knows that. There, in terms of like Reform, Reconstructionist, conservative, yeah, there's a lot of movement back and forth among people around that, around marriage. My husband grew up Reform, but then he married me, so now he's Reconstructionist. That kind of thing happens all the time, and there's no big issue. The really big difference is Orthodox, not Orthodox. After Hasidic, I should have drawn a line, because those people, the Orthodox and the Hasidic, that is a big deal. If somebody from those two groups would Orthodox, Ultra and Modern, and Hasidic would leave, it would be a huge deal. If they married someone from outside, it would be a huge deal. But the rest of them, there's a lot of movement within, lots of movement.
And then two other questions, and keep those questions coming, and I think we'll make sure we'll move on, but we'll come back to questions too. Who was the first? Which was the first movement that had women rabbis? And then also, and when, around what time was that? And then also, if you could just clarify, what is a Zionist?
Oh, great. Oh, fabulous question. Okay, so the first movement, you should be able to guess from what I said, was the Reform movement. And the first woman was ordained, wait for this, can you guess? 1973. So not very long ago. not very long ago. And the Reconstructionists were soon after. The conservatives took a while longer. When I went to rabbinical school in the Reconstructionist movement, I could have gone to the Reform, but as a woman, I could not have gone to conservative. So that you get, and of course, Orthodox, they actually, funny enough, now they do have women rabbis, but they won't call them rabbis because the modern Orthodox now have something called a rabbanit, which is a person who goes to a school and gets all the training and is able to pastor and teach and do all kinds of things, except the thing that they're most not allowed to do, which is halakhically, legally not allowed to do. They can't lead a service that has men, they can't lead men in prayer. So men and women sit separately anyway, so they can lead women in prayer if there are no men in the building, and they can do everything else. It's really strange, and they can't call them rabbi, they call them rabbanit. But the fact of the matter is, modern Orthodox synagogues are now hiring women like this to be their second rabbi. So, right, you get the idea. Anyway, that's a great question.
And then if
But
you wanted to clarify what a Zionist was.
Oh, that's a great question. I'm going to put that off because I'm going to talk
great.
about Zionism at the end. But basically, there was a time when where very few Jews were Zionists. When it started in the 1880s, there was a small group of people who had this cockamamie idea that maybe Jewish life would not do well in Europe, which is where most of them lived then, and that they would become better off if they went and lived in the Middle East, where Jewish people had lived many, many centuries before and had left around the time of Jesus. But that was a small group of people, and they called themselves Zionists because they wanted to go back to Zion, to Zion, the place where Judaism started. After the Holocaust, I would say 95% of Jews became Zionists of one sort or another. They don't all agree with everything Israel does. They have lots of criticisms of Israel. Many of them are very disappointed, angry Zionists. But becoming a Zionist after the Holocaust was basically the same as being Jewish, because everybody sort of came to the realization, and this is pretty much, I'll say 92%, not 95, but a very, very, very large majority of Jews around the world came to the realization that there ought to be a Jewish state, a place where Jews can have their own country. And that's what it means to be a Zionist today. Doesn't mean much. It doesn't mean that you're voting for the guy who's in office in Israel today. It doesn't mean anything other than you think that just like all the other nations of the world, or most other nations of the world, have a homeland and a place to live and a country they can rule. This is what being a Zionist means. So that's kind of runs through the whole gamut. They all define themselves that way. Okay? That helpful?
Yeah, and just one for your back pocket here. This might come in handy at another place too. Somebody wondered, how has having women as rabbis changed the tone or nature of rabbinical work? So I don't know if you want to get into that now or later, but.
No, that will go later. That goes later. We should move on. Okay, sorry. This is so strange not seeing your faces, but at least I get to see Ray. I get to see him smiling. I don't know about the rest of you, but I don't even see my face. I don't hear any sounds. It's very weird, but I'll do my best. Okay. So it all started when this group of slaves, who may or may not have been connected to one another beforehand, i.e. with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, the Genesis stories may or may not have actually been historical, but they may or may not. We now think that there was a group of slaves. We do believe there were a group of people in Egypt who were slaves, and we believe that somehow they ended up leaving Egypt and moving on to Canaan, as we know in the book of Exodus. And we believe that that group of people, at least some of them, had stories that they carried from their ancestors about patriarchs Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. So what I'm describing to you now is not what ultra-Orthodox Jews believe. It's what historians, critical historians believe. It's what we learn in a conservative, reform, reconstructionist context. We don't know what happened at the sea. There may have been a miracle. There may not have been a miracle. There's definitely a story that we treasure, which is that there was a sea and there were Egyptian soldiers chasing the Israelites. And on the other side was freedom, and a miracle happened and the sea parted. And there's a beautiful story in Exodus, and since you're all Christian, you know this, that when they got to the end of the sea, if this were a class, I'd ask you now, so maybe I'll ask Ray, what did they do when they get to the other side and they realize that the water came back over the Egyptians and that they are now safe? What did they do?
Well, I think Miriam led them in some dancing, right?
And singing, absolutely. So Ray yeah, you're absolutely right. So what happens on the other side, according to Exodus, is that they started to sing, and Miriam took out her tambourine, and they all sang a beautiful song at the sea, Shirat Hayam, the song of the sea. It's in the Bible. And then they danced. But the Midrash, the story about the story that we tell, is that actually the singing started before they got through the narrow place, the passage, the terrifying passage that they had to go through. They were singing all along in order to keep up their spirits. And it was and of course we like that story right now as we think about this tough time that we're going through with the pandemic, is kind of a narrow passage, and that we have to sing to keep up our good energies. So here's what happened. They started in Egypt, this crowd of people, these slaves. And, you know, the whole Jewish people thing is that they always remember they were slaves. Always remember you were slaves. The commandment that happens most often in the Torah is the 5 books of Moses, is not believe in God. It's not keep kosher. It's not Shabbat. Despite what anybody might tell you, the most frequently mentioned commandment, and it happens 36 times in the 5 books of Moses, is care for the stranger. Do not oppress the stranger. You were a stranger in the land of Egypt. So this is a primary thing. And this goes through Jews who are secular humanists and Yiddishists and conservative and reform and everybody else in between. Because it's not just in Egypt as slaves, but all the history of Judaism, which many of you probably know, after the destruction of the temple in the 1st century, right soon after Jesus's lifetime, Jews were strangers in many, many, many other places. And the primary command of Judaism is remember that you were strangers. So they went and they kind of traveled, and they went down to this mountain called Sinai. You've heard of that, right? There are hospitals called Mount Sinai Hospital, but you certainly know what I'm talking about. And then they traveled up here. Apparently it took a number of years. It wouldn't really take that long to walk from here to here, but they had to stop along the way and figure out what it meant to be people and get the commandments. And we'll talk about that in a minute. And they ended up in this place, Canaan, which is where Israel is today. And when you hear people talk about the West Bank, that area is the West Bank. And you can't see what I'm doing as I'm touching my screen, so it doesn't matter. But anyway, you get the picture. So they stopped in the 10 Commandments, and the 10 Commandments are interesting because they are very important in Judaism. They are a basis of Judaism, and of course also of Christianity. So this is why I put it in, because it's something that you can definitely, oh yeah, I get that. Now, notice, however, that the first 5 are things that really have to do with, actually, that's not true. The first 4 are sort of theological. They have to do with belief. You believe in God, you don't worship idols, you don't take the name of the Lord in vain, and you keep the Shabbat. This is because God wants you to keep the Shabbat. Then there's this 1, 5. Let's put that to a side for a minute. And then the next 4, 6, 7, 8, and 9 are actions that you do that involve other people. You don't murder, you don't commit adultery, you don't steal, and you don't lie. Okay? Those are actions, and they're people oriented. They're in Judaism, we talk about between man and God and between man and man. And then there's the 5th one, honor your parents, which people say is kind of like in between, because on the one hand, parents are people, so you're doing something you have to do for your people, your mother and father. On the other hand, it's somehow related to this theological idea that honoring God, honoring the Creator, and honoring those who created you, that they're all together in that column. And then there's number 10, which says, do not covet, which is a kind of a funny one, because how do you tell people what not to feel? If you feel like you wish that you had somebody else's, whatever mask. I was out the other day and I saw someone with a gorgeous mask. I was like, I want that mask, but I'm not supposed to covet. But how do you tell someone not to covet? Covet is an emotion. So there's a little bit about that in there too. So that's the 10 commandments. And if they had just stuck with 10, we'd be in good shape. But no. Judaism made it much more complicated. And this is an Orthodox poster that I'm sharing with you. So you see over here, it says the 10 commandments contain hints to all the 613 mitzvahs. Mitzvahs means commandments. And it's funny, he actually says this thing about emotions here. First half about man and God, second half man and man. 613 become the number of mitzvot or commandments that Judaism believes God gave, hinted in the 10. And we'll see how that happens, because it's a little bit of a complicated story. And the reason I started by showing you different kinds of Jews was that it was crucial for you to understand that for Orthodox Jews, there are 613 mitzvot. Fortunately for them, they can't follow all of them, because a little under half have to do with the temple in Jerusalem, which we don't have anymore. So that's out. But the others, they have elaborated and made even more complex. And I would say a lot of Reform Jews don't even know that there are 613 commandments. But recently, a friend of ours died, an elderly man, and at the Shiva, the service for him, which was, of course, on Zoom, my husband shared that when his father died, someone told him that he should spend the year after he died thinking about what mitzvah would he like to do in memory of his father, to honor his father's life. And he thought about it, and he picked a particular mitzvah that he thought would be appropriate, because it was related to what his father valued and cared about in his life. And it had to do with giving tzedakah, giving charity. And so that was that. But one of the people on the phone call, on the Zoom call, who wasn't Jewish, emailed my husband afterwards, and she said, well, can I have a list of all the 613 mitzvot so I can know? I can pick one, because I think this is a terrific idea, but I don't know what they are. And he said, well, you won't believe what some of them are. They're amazing, but some of them, anyway, just to get back to that for a minute, it gets very, very complex and very specific. And if you want to know all 613, you can look it up on Google it, and you can see long lists of it. Even before the Torah ended, or before the biblical period ended, there was something called the prophets. You're all familiar with the prophets. And the prophets were like, let's try to whittle this down a little. Let's get this a little more basics. Let's try to figure out what's really at the heart of this. And even because the Torah has a lot of laws in it. And they said, well, I'm going to show you where all of them said, but I'm going to show you where one said. Micah said, do justly, love mercy, and walk humbly with your God. And a lot of Reform temples will name their temple Temple Micah. But a lot of Orthodox won't, because they'll say just mercy, walking humbly, that's good, but you got to do the 613 also. So, however, as I said, a lot of the commandments had to do with the temple in Jerusalem. The temple in Jerusalem had a hugely complex set of rules about who could go in and who could go out, and what was pure and what was impure. And if you read the New Testament, you know some of this was going on. And what you may or may not know is that in the year 70, there was no longer any temple. And a lot of the people who were Jews at that time were like, I think it's all over now. We don't have a religion anymore. What are we going to do? And there was a lot of conversation about how they were going to continue without a temple. How were they even going to find God without a temple? Because the idea was that God lived, God dwelt in the temple. And they came up with something which was quite beautiful. Shimon HaTzadik was from the remnants of the great assembly that used to sit in the temple. And he said, and this is the Mishnah, which starts, the Mishnah is the book that they, in the year 200, they put together a book and say, this is what it's about now. No temple, forget temple, we don't have a temple, but here's what it's going to be about. And he says it's on three things. It's going to be on Torah, on prayer, which service of God, Torah, avodah, which really means prayer, and gemilut chasadim, acts of human kindness. Those are the three pillars that are going to keep Judaism together now that we don't have the temple. But, and then in the Talmud, which is an elaboration of the Mishnah, which was put together around 500 after the Common Era, there's a very famous story which is told over and over and over again. And we teach it to our children, like when the first day they get to Hebrew school. And there were two guys, but forget the other guy. Shammai was the mean guy who was a rabbi, but he had no patience. And a potential convert went to Shammai before the story starts. And he said, Shammai, teach me the Torah on 1 foot. I'll stand on 1 foot. You teach me the Torah. Remember, 5 books of Moses. And Shammai bangs him with a stick and says, get away, get away. And some people say, well, he was a Zen master, but whatever, he was an impatient guy. So Shammai is out of the story. And here's the part of the story that we teach everybody when they first start learning Judaism. The potential convert approaches Hillel and he says, teach me the entire Torah while standing on 1 foot. And Hillel says, that's easy. That which is hateful to you, do not do to others. All the rest is commentary. Now go and learn. And now I'll tell you a funny joke. It's going to be funny to some people anyway, because you now know about Orthodox and non-Orthodox. So the non-Orthodox people always leave out the part about go and learn. They always say, oh, so it's what hateful to you is the whole Torah. And the Orthodox people say, yeah, but it says at the end that now you have to go and learn. So it's just because the rest is commentary doesn't mean you don't have to learn it. So that's Judaism on a nutshell. If you remember one thing, you can remember this. Judaism is this, and it's also the commentary. So about the commentary, which is really where it gets going. The Jews left Jerusalem, as I told you, and there's the map. So now you can see, the way it plays out here with the different countries. So they left, and they ended up in what is currently Iraq, in a place called Babylonia. Baghdad, you can see Baghdad and Mosul. This is where it became a center of Jewish life. We're talking here the first, 4 or 5, there are 4 or 5 common era centuries. And in there, they started to develop a culture, and they developed something called the Talmud. Have you heard of the Talmud? That's the commentary. Oh, there are the 613 commandments, but you can't even read them. I just wanted to show you that if you opened up the Jewish Encyclopedia, you could find them listed one after another after another. The first one, anyone know what the first one is? They go in order for when they appear in the Torah. So you can guess, Ray can guess what the first one is. I'll give you a hint, Ray. You have already fulfilled it.
Already fulfilled it.
Yeah. And you're not even Orthodox Jew. A lot of them apply to other people too. Just it's in Genesis, right at the beginning. It's the first thing God says.
Is it something about creation?
Yeah, well, but the commandment. I mean, God creates the world, and
Oh,
He says it's good, 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 good. But then He
be
commands.
fruitful and multiply.
That's it. That's the first one. And the rabbis say that involves having two children. So you've done it.
Phew.
You're on your way. Now you only have 612 more to go. Okay. So how does it work? Now I'm going to tell you how the Talmud thing worked. The way it works is as follows, because this is Judaism. And even those of us who are not Orthodox, this is what I want to stress. Even those of us who are not Orthodox still study this and learn from it and consider it our heritage, even if we don't do everything. So here's how it works. Making of a Jewish law. So the law is don't mix milk with meat. So here's the Torah. It says it 3 times. And this is what it says. You shall not boil a kid in its mother's milk. You shall not boil a kid in its mother's milk. And then in 21, it says, in Deuteronomy 21, twice in Exodus, once in Deuteronomy, it says a few things, and then it repeats, you shall not boil a kid in its mother's milk. So the joke is that God says to Moses, you shall not boil a kid in its mother's milk. And Moses says, oh, you mean that I have to have separate dishes and I have to wait 6 hours between meat and milk and I have to have a restaurant for dairy and restaurants for meat? And God says, no, I just said you shall not boil a kid in its mother's milk. And eventually they buy back and forth. And finally God says, have it your way. So here's how the Jews have it their way. They have something called the Talmud. It's called the Babylonian Talmud because it was in Babylonia, as I explained to you. And in the center is the conversation of rabbis over centuries about many, many, many things. There is 2,700 pages of the Talmud. If you read 1 page a day, it would take you 7.5 years. I happen to know this because I am currently reading the Talmud 1 page a day. 1 page a day. There is something, it's a practice called Daf Yomi, the day's page. The page is called the Daf. And in Daf Yomi, it started in the 20s in Poland, and it's now in its like 7th or 8th cycle. But it is that Jews all over the world, not just Orthodox, all Jews all over the world who want to participate in this, read the same 1 page every day for 7.5 years, and then they start again. So a new cycle just started this January, and because it started in January 5th, and I said to my husband, I said, hey, why don't we do Daf Yomi this cycle? And he said, all right. So we started doing it, and we read one of these pages a day in English translation on the internet, because there's a website where it's all translated. And this is all the commentary of centuries of commentators about the Talmud. So what happens to this thing about the meat and the boiling the kid in its mother's milk? It sounds very simple, right? Just don't get any kids and boil them in the milk of their mother. And so what happens in the Mishnah, which is the beginning of the Talmud, the Mishnah is the first book that happens in 200. The Talmud is the commentary on the Mishnah, and then everything else is commentary on the Talmud. So this is a religion that's based on commentary on commentary on commentary. First thing is the Mishnah. So the Mishnah said, it's prohibited to boil any kind of flesh and milk, except for locusts and fish. And now it goes a little further. May meat and cheese be brought to the table, except for locusts and fish. So we don't eat locusts, but we can do fish. A person who vowed not to eat meat may eat locusts and fish. This is our sacred text, right? And then fowl and cheese may, according to Beit Shammai, be brought to the table together, but they can't be eaten together. So you have chicken and cheese, according to this rabbi, Shammai, the one who hit the guy with the stick, they can bring to the table a piece of chicken and piece of cheese, but they're not allowed to eat them. But according to Beit Hillel, they can't be brought to the table nor eaten. Now, at this point, you're like, wait a second. How is this a religion? Why are they discussing this? And why are there two opinions? How do you know what you're supposed to do? Well, that's part of Judaism, is that there's always a lot of different opinions. And the Talmud records all the opinions, including the ones that don't make it into the law. So by the time we get to the Middle Ages, Hillel has won on this one. You cannot bring them to the table. In fact, by the time you get to the Middle Ages, you can't even like have them in the same part of the kitchen. but you can see, if you study the Talmud, that there was a time when there was a rabbi who thought that they could go to the table together. Again, why are they getting into all these details? It's incredibly complex. So just to show you, now we're in the Gemara, which is the commentary that makes up the Talmud. Gemara and Talmud are the same. It says, but here, if you permit one to place the meat of birds and cheese on the same table, some might come to place the meat of animals and cheese on a table and eat the meat cooked in the milk, and thereby would transgress a Torah law. Because at this point, it's not just a kid, it's anything. And so the meat of birds is placed with cheese on a table, but it can't be eaten together. That was Beit Shammai. But Beit Hillel says, don't even place it there. And Yosei agrees that even according to Beit Shammai, the meat cannot be eaten with the cheese. So just want to give you a sense of what this is like. So then it goes on and on. The Shulchan Aruch is a later code where they go into what's the wild animals and the chicken and the this and the that. And now we come to Reconstructionists, Reform, Renewal. We have something called eco-kashrut. Eco-kashrut is the kashrut of not necessarily worrying about meat and milk being separate, but maybe not eating meat at all. It's where you start thinking about the environment, you start thinking about where the food is grown and how much the workers get paid. You think about health, you think about many issues. And what Jews who are not Orthodox have to say about kashrut is that it was a really good idea, but had a few flaws. The flaws had to do with the specifics they got into, but the good idea was thinking it really matters what you consume. That what you put into your mouth does matter because it has implications, ethical implications. So the updated version of kashrut, that's the Hebrew word for kosher, is to think about it in terms of ecology. So I want to stop now. And I want to give you
we got some questions.
Yes. So I hope this was helpful, because I think that I wanted you to see how the tradition grew and then how it gets reinterpreted.
Great.
Yes.
And we have we have a 19 minutes. And so to clarify, the Talmud is from the 6th century, 500s. Is
right,
that?
Exactly.
But commentaries on the Talmud are happening even, I guess, today.
Exactly.
Because I think one of the most interesting things is what does it mean to keep the Sabbath? And in some ways, okay, seems simple enough, but what counts as not keeping the Sabbath? And now there's internet. We talked about internet earlier. Does that count? But and so one of the questions here then is, does it seem like, in a sense, people choose which rabbis and which commentaries that they tend to follow, and how do you kind of, is there some worry? We talk about cafeteria Christians who, or cafeteria whoever, who I like that piece or I like that piece. Do you have some of that, or what's that like?
Well, yeah, but see, this is the thing. People are, the Orthodox people have their rabbi who then reads the Talmud and makes a decision for his community. So yes, in the Talmud, it says all these different things, but I'm an Orthodox Jew and I go to this temple so-and-so in Silver Spring, Maryland. And at that temple, Rabbi Cohen, he's read the whole Talmud and he's decided that for our community, it goes with Hillel for this one. So yeah, there's not a lot of craziness going on in the Orthodox because the Orthodox follow their local rabbi. That's part of what it means to be Orthodox. Now, when you get into the Reform, it is a lot of picking and choosing. A lot of my Reform friends who grew up Reform, they're like, well, we didn't eat ham in our house. And as for that shellfish thing, we never heard of that. So they just didn't know. They literally didn't know that shellfish was also forbidden. They just knew about ham not being allowed. So there's a lot of variety in practices in that way. In the Reconstructionist movement, we have a tremendous amount of variety in practice in people's homes. We have people in our community, many of whom are intermarried. They have a Christmas tree in their house. They have ham and shellfish and who knows what all. We have other people in our communities who do many more of the traditional things. We have people in our community who walk to synagogue on Shabbat because they don't want to drive. But it doesn't get crazy and out of control, because within the community, when we're together, we follow a kind of the rabbi and the community together figure out what they want to do. So in my community, for example, a Reconstructionist synagogue that I belong to, we have our own kosher policy. It's not Orthodox kosher. It doesn't require the same things that Orthodox kosher would require, but it requires some of the things that eco-kosher would require. And we set it up. We with the rabbi and a committee and a democratic practice. So any food you bring into our synagogue, it goes with our rules. So we make our own rules, and we also value bringing community together. Okay.
A couple other questions here. Were you born into a Reconstructionist family?
Yeah.
I mean,
Yes.
and
Yeah.
and also then what's most inspiring to you about being Jewish?
Oh, that's a great thing. Well, then I'll just move on to this. What's most inspiring to me about being Jewish is the sets of laws, which I was going to go from kashrut, which is kind of like, like, what does this matter, to something that you could clearly see matters, and it has to do with making the poor person dignified, making sure that even a person who's an orphan girl is given money by the community from charity to furnish her with a dowry. There's all these wonderful rules in the Talmud about how when somebody is poor, you have to give them sufficient to their needs. And there's a whole idea that if somebody is shamed, you should give them as if it's a loan, even though it's not a loan, so that they don't feel that they're embarrassed. This is all Talmud laws that I love, because they talk about how we help maintain a just world, to the extent that they rabbis could imagine doing that in their limited way. And even if someone was once rich and now they're poor, they used to ride on a horse with a servant running in front of him, but now the person has fell from his station, so they have to buy him a horse and a servant to run in front of him, because they don't want him to lack what he needs because of his own dignity. So there's a lot of wonderful rules like that. And at that point, I wanted to talk about Shabbat, because Shabbat is very, very, very important to Judaism. The meaning of Sabbath is to celebrate time rather than space. And it's particularly interesting right now in the pandemic time, because some people are saying, well, sort of like it's Shabbat for 45 days already because we don't go to work. But the truth is that that's not what Shabbat is. Shabbat is not being stuck in your house. Shabbat is a time when you take a break from doing and making and achieving and controlling. And there's all kinds of very, very specific rules about tearing toilet paper before Shabbat, so you don't have to tear, and things that'll make you completely nuts. But the basic ideas are so valuable that all of us, all the different kinds of Jews, have found ways to incorporate this into our lives. Then I said I wanted to run you through a little bit about the history and why American Jews turned out to be who they are, since you all live in America. So it's 2 minutes, which is that Jews lived all over Europe, from Christian Europe, for all these centuries. But in Eastern Europe, ended up a lot of them, most of the Jews in the world were living in Eastern Europe around the 1880s. And there was a tremendous amount of pogroms, of terrible things that happened to Jews, oppression, and a bunch of them came to America. So between 1880 and 1924, 2 million Jews from Eastern Europe came to America. And if you know Jews today in America, the chances are 70% or 80% that they have a grandparent who came in this period of time, a great-grandparent if they're young. If they're my age, they're grandparents. Like all four of my grandparents, all four of my husband's grandparents. But if you're younger people, it would be great-grandparents. But they're descended from this immigration of Eastern European Jews. That's who they are descended from. And what we take from that is HIAS, the Hebrew Immigrant Grade Society, was founded because they were Jews. We were trying to bring them in, and we do it now because we are Jews. Most of the people that HIAS works with today are not Jewish. They're coming from South America. They're coming from Mexico, whatever. And then the Holocaust, the strangers, and this is my last, oh no, I'm sorry. Founding of the State of Israel and the Nakba, we don't have time to go into in great detail, but I wanted to end with a poem. But before I end with the poem, I want to answer the question about women, because you asked that question earlier, right? And I didn't want to let it go. I think it has changed. I think that when people started, I'll give you a perfect example, and maybe this might be a good example, but people would refer to me as Rabbi Nancy, whereas my male colleagues would be referred to as Rabbi Ranker or Rabbi Cohen. And now in my community, everybody is Rabbi Ray, Rabbi Nancy. We've just gotten like everybody has gone to the way that the women started to be referred to. At first, we women were like, what? You know, like, why are you calling me that? You know, why are you like, what am I, your mother or something? You know, like sister, like I'm not Rabbi Riker, you know? But now it has moved so that I think, so that might not be a great answer, but it's what I think of right now, that there's been a kind of loosening of the hierarchical view of the rabbi as being set apart in that way. And I think it's been a good thing. Other questions? Because I'm aware of the time and I wanted to end with the quote.
Yeah.
A poem. I like ending with a poem.
Yeah, especially with what's kind of been happening today and some of the anti-Semitic
Yeah.
signs and other kinds of feelings that you know, wanted to see what, you know, if you wanted to comment on that. And certainly it's not new in the United States. I mean, you talked about certainly many Jews immigrated here,
Yeah.
but anti-Semitism has run throughout U.S. history and continues, and maybe is a little more out in the open today. Or you know, what are you? We want to be sure we're listening to the Jewish community and not just making our own formulations about anti-Semitism. But what are you observing?
I think due to anti-Semitism, and thank you for asking about that. So I actually studied in graduate school. I got my PhD at Temple, and my field was Jewish Christian relations. And I was working in a field around post-Holocaust dialogue in Europe and the United States. And this was in the late 70s and early 80s. And around the time of the 90s, I got really bored with my field because I thought that we talked about the Holocaust too much, and that anti-Semitism wasn't such a big problem anymore. And around the end, like the middle 90s, I kind of quit wanting to do what I had been doing, which was working with Christians to help them with their anti-Semitism. I decided, you know what, this isn't like not an issue anymore. I don't think there's a problem. And I started doing other work in a completely different field, having to do with pastoral care and not being involved at all with interfaith work. And what brought me back to interfaith work was September 11th, because then I saw that the Muslim community was, you know, in vulnerable situation. And I wanted to get involved with Muslim, Jewish dialogue and bringing Christians and Muslims and Jews together to understand each other. That became, so my whole interfaith got a whole new lease on life then. But before, just to say that it was only recently that I have decided to revise my opinion that anti-Semitism is no longer a problem, and that we talk about the Holocaust too much. So when all those years, like after I was so into it in the 80s, the early 80s, mid 80s, for a long period of time, I'll say from like 85 until very recently, I hardly ever talked about the Holocaust. And I was even opposed to the idea that that Jews should be schlepped to the concentration camps to see what happened there so that they could learn, and to make the Christians learn about it and the Muslims learn about it. But I have changed my tune. So I am here to tell you that, first of all, that someone who's 68 can change and learn and grow and become different and have different ideas. I now think anti-Semitism is something to look at and worry about. And particularly in the Jewish world now, we're very concerned because a lot of Jewish history shows us that when there's an economic downturn, there's more anti-Semitism. Because people are unhappy, and they're just unhappy. But we also have a president now who's, well, he's not, I don't know, anti-Semite, but he's also, he's empowered and encouraged a certain type of person in our society who is vulnerable to anti-Semitic thoughts, and even some who promote them. And I think that that energy that's out there in the world and a leadership that allows it to be out there is very, very troubling. And you know, Jewish history is a lot of stories about plagues that ended up getting blamed on the Jews. I'm not saying that's going to happen now, but I would say Jews are very unsettled and very concerned. Yeah, I would say that it's an issue to think about and learn about. But remember always that we are still mostly, not all, but mostly white people. I'd say like 85% white people. Jews are. The rest are. We have some African American and Asian Jews and Latino Jews, but mostly white people in America. I'm saying America, and that most of us still benefit from white privilege. And we're all very conscious that even as we have this concern, we're, I would say, at least in my world, in my circles, we're still more concerned about what's going to happen to Muslims in this country. And we're more concerned about race and the enduring effects of race, because the story of Jews in this country is a very interesting story of people who were oppressed for their religious beliefs throughout their history after the first century, coming to this country and benefiting from the white privilege in a big way. And jumping class, for the most part, not entirely, but for the most part, jumping class from the peddler class of the people, the immigrants who came in our Jewish world were not wealthy immigrants. They didn't come here to go to medical school. They came here to get out of poverty, grinding poverty in Europe and oppression. And they came here and within a couple of generations have done very, very well. So I always want to say that when I talk about anti-Semitism.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think that's you bring in the different layers. There's, you know, there might be some white privilege, but there's also, you know, racism and discrimination, anti-Semitism for sure. What a follow-up question to that is, what would you want to share with non-Jews? How can we be a part of, I don't know what the, is there a term to be anti-Semitic, you know, anti-racist?
It's called allyship. It's called solidarity. There's definitely a term for it. I know, because I've been working in anti-Muslim, and I mean, we always end up saying, but we have 5 negatives in this name of the organization because we're, you know, against Islamophobia. You know, no. The answer is standing in solidarity, allyship with people. That's what it's all about, and that's what I've been doing with Muslims now for 19 years. Yeah, 19 years I've been doing work with Catherine Laurie and people like that. And it's all about, and I know, and I can say from being on the other end of it, that sometimes it's fascinating, because when being on the other end, like you Christians asking me, I've been asking Muslims this question for a long time now. And they have said, and I really do think they're in a worse situation than Jews are, largely because they're not white for the most part. Most Muslims, not all in this country, are not in fact white. And they're also in that way doubly troubled in the way that Jews are not. But in any case, what Muslims say to me is, it means so much to just have you showing up, and it's the same thing with us. When we had that in Pittsburgh, when the people were shot, and in the synagogue there, and actually the synagogue my husband grew up in Pittsburgh, is where that took place, and people were killed. There was a local, the local response was incredibly heartening. People were really showed up. People in Pittsburgh, Muslims and Christians, showed up. They showed up day after day after day to put their bodies in marching and speeches and inviting people in to have their synagogue services in their church, or having whatever. I mean, there was a Muslim guy who did some kind of a fundraising thing on Facebook to raise money for the people, victims, and it was really quite touching, and it means so much. Means so much. And I guess as a Jew now, I've had my shoe on both feet, because I've been there for Muslims when their mosques have been attacked, and now I've been there when people have shown up for me. And sometimes the same people. Like, I went to a demonstration about anti-Semitism recently, and some of my Muslim friends were there with the sign saying, "We stand with the Jewish community," and it was so meaningful.
Well, thanks for sharing that. Yeah, I don't know if any of our Maryland students remember, we had something on our mall there where I was present, and in fact the Muslim chaplain was invited to share words of support and encouragement for the Jewish community, and one of the Christian chaplains, it wasn't me but another one, had wanted to share some words of solidarity too. So I know we're at time here, and you wanted to end with a blessing.
Yeah, well, I wanted to end with this poem because I like it, and because Judaism has many, many, many blessings. And sometimes you, like I said, with the kashrut, you can get lost in the details. If my husband and I just spent an entire, 3 months reading through one volume of the Talmud that was all about, you say a blessing of this for the bread, and this for a rainbow, and this for a cookie, and this for a this, and that. There are millions of blessings. And as part of Judaism is to be very specific and to notice that everything matters, and all these little details actually matter. So when I was reading to you before about the cheese and the locusts and fish, and what goes on the table, and what can you put on the table but not eat, but whatever, that's Judaism. It's about that. And Marge Piercy, who's a Jewish poet, wrote something that I thought really captured what I think Judaism is about. The discipline of blessings is to taste each moment, the bitter, the sour, the sweet, and the salty, and be glad for what does not hurt. The art is in compressing attention to each little and big blossom of the tree of life, to let the tongue sing each fruit, its savor, its aroma, and its use. Attention is love. What we must give children, mothers, fathers, pets, our friends, the news, the woes of others. What we want to change, we curse and then pick up a tool. Bless whatever you can with eyes and hands and tongue. If you can't bless it, get ready to make it new. So thank you all so much for listening.
Thank you so much, Nancy. You've blessed me, and thanks for sharing. And we'll have this up on YouTube, and we'll share that with folks. So you can also, the folks here, you can please feel free to share that. We want plenty of people to be able to hear this wonderful presentation. We're going to take a break next week, and then we'll be back the following week with kind of a more in-depth piece on Islam with Celine is going to share with us, the Muslim chaplain at Harvard.
Oh, so, she's amazing. She's just amazing.
Yeah, we're gonna we're so happy for that. So thanks again, and
You.
blessings,
It's
everybody.
so weird to not having been able to see you, and I'm so sorry. Couldn't see anything, and it was just weird. And I kept touching my screen to point things out, and you couldn't see that at all, of course, obviously.
The laser pointers don't do much good in these.
Now, Ray, did they see me? Did you guys see
Yep.
me? You saw me and Ray, two little boxes on the side.
And I think if it was like mine, I could see I could scroll through and see everybody at least, but.
I couldn't see anything, not a thing. Okay, thank you all.
Yeah,
Have a good
thanks, Nancy.
night. Stay well.